Hello and welcome to World History B, Unit 7, the conclusion of World War II. Alright, as a reminder, the Axis powers were Germany, Japan, and Italy. The Allies were Great Britain, France, the United States because of Pearl Harbor, and now the Soviet Union. Now remember, the Soviet Union had signed with Hitler a non-aggression pact saying, we're not going to mess with each other. But Hitler had no intention of keeping this promise. And in 1941, Hitler invaded. It was known as Operation Barbarossa, and it was always his plan to destroy what he felt were inferior people in the Russian country. The Soviet Union, however, was not prepared for the attack. Stalin absolutely believed that Hitler would not break the agreement. Some say that even as the tanks were rolling up to the border, Stalin said, no, don't fire on them, not till they cross the border, because I don't believe that they would actually cross us. But that's exactly what the Germans did. So unprepared, so taken by surprise were the Russian forces that the military was pushed all the way back to one of the biggest cities in all of Russia, deep in the heartland near Moscow, called Stalingrad. This was one of the biggest, if not the biggest, battle of all of the Second World War. In order to force a surrender, Hitler's plan was to starve the city and all of its 2.5 million people. They destroyed any sources of supplies that could get into the city at all, figuring eventually they would just give up. But what they didn't take into account was how resilient the Russians were. They would eat cattle and horse feed, cats, dogs, crows, rats, whatever it took to survive, because they knew that they were much more prepared for the coming winter. Winters in Russia are brutal. The snow, the cold, it burns and bites into your fingers and your arms and your legs. It does kill people. And they knew that they could outlast the Germans. And that's exactly what they did, but at great cost. Over 1 million Russians died because they were refusing to surrender. Only 150,000 Germans died, but that was a huge chunk of the German military in Russia, and it was a huge loss. After those 150,000 troops had eventually died off, the Russian military and civilians were finally able to counterattack and caused the biggest humiliation of all of World War II to Hitler's forces. This was absolutely the turning point where Hitler began to lose ground. Meanwhile, the Americans had joined the war after Pearl Harbor and were plotting with the British and the French to counterattack from the west. This counterattack would culminate into one of the biggest land invasions of all time, D-Day, June 6, 1944, the day in which the Allies began their invasion of Normandy, France during World War II. Planes, ships, tanks, and 3 million troops landed on this one beach and stormed the German forces entrenched there. By September 1944, the Allies had not only taken back all of France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, but they were actually pushing into the heart of Germany. The leader of this invasion was American Dwight Eisenhower, who would eventually become the President of the United States of America. Now, Germany had always intended to fight a two-front war, but he didn't realize that these two fronts would end up collapsing in on him. Allies from the west, Soviets from the east, his friend in the south, Mussolini, his people had enough of him and his losses in Africa, and he tried to escape his own country disguised as a German soldier, but his people found him, shot him, and hung him by his toes. And on April 29th, rather than admit defeat, he and his wife Eva Braun committed suicide, ending the war in Europe. Over in Japan, however, Japan was becoming a much more difficult nut to crack. They were a very efficient force, and to be honest, the island hopping, while successful, was very slow and very bloody. Now, on top of that, now that the war in Europe was over, Russia was sending its troops to join into the fight, and America didn't want to have to share Japan if they won the war, like they knew that they were going to have to share Germany, and realized that even though they were allies with the Soviets, they weren't friends. these were not countries that got along well with each other. They didn't trust each other. So President Truman's advisors convinced him to use the bomb, the atomic bomb, to bring the war to the quickest possible end. 2 bombs were dropped, one on the city of Hiroshima and one on the city of Nagasaki, eliminating both cities in an instant. The atomic bomb had never been used before. No one was prepared for it. Everyone knew that different nations were testing it, but tests are not the same as the real thing when you see an entire city evaporated. It worked, and Japan surrendered to the U.S. unconditionally. The tragedy of war. Now, we had a winner and we had a loser. The Allies were the winners and the Axis was the losers. But this war, the winners suffered greatly. Russia in particular, over 20 million people died. Only 8.7 of those 20 million were military deaths. Most of them were civilian deaths. The British, now they're a much smaller country than Russia, lost almost 500,000, but their major cities like London, their economic centers, were in pieces, needing complete rebuilding. America was one of the few that left unscathed. They did lose 400,000 American citizen soldiers, but suffered very little land destruction other than the military base at Pearl Harbor. So why is this all important to know other than just, okay, yeah, a lot of people died? Well, because this set the tone for war for the rest of history up until today. This is why we don't see major nations go into war with each other. Whereas before World War II, it was fairly common. This is why America originally didn't want to get involved, because they see that in Europe, major countries are always fighting each other. But the aftermath was never this bad. The winners had never suffered so greatly in their victory. And as a result, everyone can look back at this and see, we might win a war, but the cost is not worth it, especially as time marches on and the weapons become more and more and more destructive. When we have nuclear missiles that can fire all the way around the world and multiple numbers of them, it makes major powers think twice before they go head on with each other. And this would directly affect the way conflicts would be fought for the next, well, let's say all the way to the current day. That's it for this video. If you have any questions, thank you, and let me know in class.